I will be discussing issues related to Indigenous rights in this piece. I do not identify as Indigenous or Métis. I was born to visiting peoples on the land of the ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as determined by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. The Red Cross movement has been around for 160 years. It is amongst the oldest international humanitarian organizations in the world. The Canadian Red Cross was founded in 1896 by George Ryerson, a physician in Toronto, Ontario, in his home with a few of his friends. Little did they know it would become one of the most important Canadian humanitarian organizations in the country's history. With an emphasis on mercy and pacifism, the organization would grow to become part of the wider umbrella of the International Red Cross. Ryerson had fought in the Northwest Rebellion, during which a militant group of Métis and Cree rose up against the Confederation, resulting in a violent suppression, leaving hundreds killed or wounded. With some military experience, Ryerson was inspired to serve the good of humanity, bringing the Red Cross to Canada. Throughout its history, the Canadian Red Cross was firmly associated with the Church. Oftentimes, the health of the people was synonymous with the health of the faith. For I was hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. The gospel was healing, and healing was the work of the Lord, as they firmly believed at the time. However, no matter how many veterans were fed, clothed, and supported, the consistency of this philosophy was arguably low. In remote lands, far from the busy bustle of Toronto, Calgary, and Montreal, meat and vegetables were almost unknown at the residential school, while prisoners were being served meat and potatoes, pork chops, broiled chicken, and sometimes even steak.
For children who live with the midnight sun in their summer holidays, an explanation. They come to school in September, go home for holidays in June. Instead of the isolation and neglect of the past, a free and equal chance with children in urban centers.
The First Nations were suffering insurmountable food insecurity in their homes and their schools, but the government did nothing, and the Red Cross was preoccupied with its own ideological needs. The Great Depression helped worsen the situation after 1929, when wages dropped and volunteering became implausible. The rest of Red Cross history until 2008 and its relationship to the First Nations is very much a story of what the organization had not done, rather than what they had done. The Second World War in 1939 resulted in their efforts moving overseas, leaving the domestic front completely preoccupied with the war effort. Here, the relationship with food was still conservative in nature. Seen as a feminine duty, women were most inclined to show their wartime patriotism by preparing food packages by grace of the Red Cross. After the war, peacetime developed considerable opportunities for expansion. The 1960s and 70s saw great progress, only hampered by the tainted blood scandal of the 70s and early 80s, which hurt the organization's reputation considerably. It is this stage in the history of the Canadian Red Cross in which we find a set of problems. The first is that very little information about the subject is published by academics. Mobilizing Mercy by Sarah Glassford is the only notable source that documents the organization's records, and it ends in the 80s. Secondly, information about what the Red Cross is doing is largely communicated through the Red Cross website blog. Things have changed for the Red Cross, and they're in need of academic attention, because a food emergency has been unfolding behind the scenes for the past 2 centuries that has only been publicized since June 1st, 2008. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee revealed the terror brought upon by the residential school system and its consequences, as well as the overarching effects of colonialism for the socioeconomic well-being of Indigenous peoples. The modern-day leading causes of food insecurity in First Nations homes comes in the form of high food prices, paired with low income. The remoteness and lack of guided development results in egregious food prices, which the government has not yet remedied. The following information does not come from academic sources, but direct observation of the online Red Cross services. So how is the Red Cross helping with this issue? Firstly, transportation needs can be outsourced to the Red Cross using their nutrition and transportation service. The subcategory of these services are Meals on Wheels, nutritional networking, and mobile food bank. These divisions provide help for people's food needs when transportation is an issue. The limitations of these services come in two forms. While it does help people who have to spend large amounts of money on grocery trips in remote locations, it does not offset the initial markup from the cost of transporting them to the remote grocer. When trying to help a community in need, oftentimes there is an external issue, an ice storm, a war, a financial crisis. However, Indigenous communities have been suffering from internal issues that manifest themselves over months, years, and even decades. The United Nations, another far more prominent international organization, outlines their definition of food security with the UN Food and Agriculture Pillars of Food Security. First, food availability. Second, food access. Third, food utilization. And finally, food stability. First Nations communities do have access to food, but there are major impediments when it comes to its actual utilization. Even with availability, access is still difficult from an economic and logistical perspective. Long trips, high gas usage, and lack of alternatives are the forefront of these economic restrictions. This is the current step the Red Cross provides assistance with. Coming to food utilization, the quality of food is distinctly low and currently remains. As with most internal issues, there is no easily identifiable direct cause, as the problem is structural. The Red Cross cannot force people to buy healthier food. The same goes for the Canadian government. As we come to the final pillar, food stability, the problem becomes obvious. The reliability of the First Nation food system is incredibly low, resulting in worse conditions for public health and general well-being. As Tabitha Martins wrote in her reflections, I believe in clean water, soil, food, and air. They are connected. You cannot have one without the other. Just as the UN agrees that, to secure food stability, the first three pillars must come first. The complexity of food insecurity amongst First Nations peoples is immense, and needs more attention from third-party organizations, as the government has repeatedly shown inadequacy in helping the sustainable development of these communities, displaying superficial understanding of using cultural methods and non-colonial approaches. Here we identify the fundamental problem with humanitarian aid. The solution is self-identified. It's easy to see suffering when a hurricane sweeps through Haiti or Florida, but hard to hear the quiet struggles of isolated communities in the far-flung communities of the North, or the upended economic fate of First Nations peoples living off reserve. So what can we do? International emergency relief organizations are massive bodies of hope. Millions of voices answer calls for action when faced with catastrophes of biblical proportions. If enough attention can be brought to Indigenous issues and characterized by their appropriate pertinence, then the building and education of Indigenous cultural food can be supported in repayment for the skills and habits that were banned and stolen. In 2017, the Red Cross launched their Indigenous Peoples Framework, a concrete composition of the organization's stance on Indigenous peoples and their crisis. They established 4 pillars of the framework as guiding principles: commitment to reconciliation, cultural safety, collaboration, and community-based delivery. After a long history of ignorance to the longest and most brutal domestic humanitarian crisis in Canada, non-government organizations are starting to adapt to a new level of respect and understanding that exists between the visiting people and the Indigenous. The future is uncertain, but hope exists to rebuild and reestablish traditions and sustainable food practices that have been thousands of years in the making. Dependence on unhealthy, high-processed foods can be severed as long as we strive to support the noble effort of reconciliation. The Red Cross offers more resources for Indigenous food insecurity than ever before, but there is still much more that can be done. To uphold the third UN pillar of food security, Utilization, through cultural methods and normalization of caring for the land as it always had been, will improve the community's relationship with food and in turn their cultural and economic autonomy.